On May 17, 2017, Chris Cornell returned to his hotel room following a concert in Detroit. He spoke to his wife Vicky on the phone, and what he said to her made her blood run cold. The life expectancy of the Seattle grunge scene's leading men is sadly below the national average. Soundgarden's Chris Cornell had all the trappings that afflicted contemporaries like Kurt Cobain and Layne Staley, both who met early demises. But Chris somehow hung in there. He married, became a father, and even launched a solo career. It looked like he'd survived where others hadn't. And then, at 51 years of age, it all came tumbling down. Christopher John Boyle was born in Seattle, Washington on July 20th, 1964, to a Jewish mother, Karen Cornell, and a Catholic father, Edward F. Boyle. His mother was a psychic, and she may or may not have foreseen the end of her marriage. When the divorce happened, Chris and his siblings gave up their father's name and took their mother's maiden name. It was a shaky start to his life. Chris ended up in Catholic school, and it didn't sit well with him. He had a lot of questions about religion, and the school didn't like it. His mother saw the writing on the wall and pulled him out of school before the principal could kick him out. Chris then went to Shorewood High School, but there was only trouble in his future. One day, a young Chris went into a neighbor's basement and made an amazing discovery. There was a large collection of albums by the Beatles. For 2 years, he listened to these albums. The mystical world of the Beatles was like therapy for him because things in the real world weren't going well at all. Chris called himself a loner. Being around people made him anxious, so he turned to rock music. But sadly, music wasn't always enough. Both of his parents were heavy drinkers, and from a very young age, he began following in their footsteps, drinking and using substances to deal with his problems. When he was just 14 years old, Chris tried PCP. The experience was disastrous, and what followed was even worse. He began to suffer from agoraphobia and panic disorder. Chris dropped out of high school and spent 2 years barely leaving the house at all. As such, his road to fame wasn't exactly glamorous. Chris had to grapple with his various mental ailments and keep a job at the same time. He worked as a dishwasher, busboy, fishmonger, and eventually a sous chef. But despite building a colorful resume, Chris was still in a dark place. Thankfully, it was his mother who threw him a lifeline. When Chris's mother bought him a snare drum, she changed his life forever. He later said this small gift was a lifesaver because it kicked off his journey towards becoming a musician. Chris wasted little time and began honing his skills. Now, all he needed was a band to play with. After a short stint in a cover band, Chris and his friends Hiro Yamamoto and Kim Thale formed Soundgarden. It soon became clear that Soundgarden would be better if Chris got up from the drum kit and concentrated on being the lead vocalist. They then brought on drummer Matt Cameron to round out the band. They were ready to take on the world. It didn't take long for the indie record label Sub Pop to come calling, and Soundgarden made 2 EPs with them. The unexpected success of these 2 EPs led Chris and his bandmates to have their choice of any major record label. They resisted the urge to go mainstream and signed with another indie label, SST Records. They were taking a huge chance. With the indie label, SST Records, Soundgarden made their first album, which they called Ultra Mega OK. Let's just say it was more than just okay. In 1990, Soundgarden got a nod from the Grammys for Best Metal Performance. It was time for Chris and the guys to quit the indie scene and sign on with a major label. Signing on with A&M Records was a very big deal. Bands like Soundgarden were becoming known as Seattle grunge, but Soundgarden was the first of these to get with a major label like A&M. With their first album with a major label, Soundgarden was ready to define a generation. Soundgarden had the edgy sound that most grunge bands had, but it also had Chris's lyrics. Music lovers were looking for something complex, and with Chris and Soundgarden, they found it. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Soundgarden had another huge draw for audiences. In addition to his lyrics, there was also Chris's voice. He sported an incredible 4-octave range. More than one critic and audience poll listed him as one of the greatest rock and roll singers of all time. But all the praise in the world couldn't help him with his depression. While living in Seattle, Chris had a roommate named Andrew Wood, who was another staple of the Seattle grunge scene. The two were more than just roommates, they were close friends. When Wood tragically lost his life to a drug overdose at the age of 24, Chris took the loss hard. Chris said that after Wood's passing, he kept seeing his friend, sometimes on the side of the road as he was driving. It would always take him a few minutes to once again realize that his friend was gone forever. Chris had to deal with the loss of Wood, and he turned to music to deal with his sadness. Chris was still in Soundgarden when he formed the band Temple of the Dog as a tribute to his friend Wood. Along with Chris, Temple of the Dog also featured a then mostly unknown musician named Eddie Vedder. Vedder later acknowledged his debt to Cornell. Hunger Strike was the breakout single for this supergroup, and Vedder's voice was a standout. But there was also big things in store for Soundgarden. In 1994, Chris and Soundgarden released their fourth album, Super Unknown. The world, and probably Cornell himself, had no idea how high this album would soar. It debuted on the Billboard 200 at number 1. It reached quintuple platinum status in the US, and received a Grammy nomination for Best Rock Album. Chris had built a huge legion of fans, but they were in for a shock. In 1998, Chris took to working on songs for a solo album. This would eventually get the name Euphoria Morning, and the result was a little less rock and more folk. This change shocked his most beloved fans. While he received another Grammy nomination, the album didn't do well in terms of sales. If this wasn't bad news enough, there was more. The grunge music scene had its share of untimely demises, and the culprits are often depression and drug use. Around this time, Chris became saddened by the sheer number of losses he'd experienced in his life. Unfortunately, to deal with his grief, Chris turned to an old and very dangerous friend. Chris returned to the substance use of his youth. Around the same time, he became a father. His daughter, Lillian Jean, was born on June 28, 2000. The turn of the millennium was bringing big changes for Chris, and not all of them were good. In 2002, Chris was busy working on a new band called Audioslave. Sadly, at the same time, he was also struggling with addiction. He had to cancel a show at Ozfest and later admitted the hard truth. He was in rehab. He did emerge sober, but his problems weren't over yet. In May 2005, Chris made an unusual trip with Audioslave. He went to Havana, Cuba to do a concert. The concert took a long time to arrange. The concert's organizers were the Ministry of Culture in Cuba and the US Department of Treasury. Considering that the two organizations were likely not on the best terms, it's a wonder the concert actually happened. It did, but the venue was something of an ironic twist. Audioslave performed in a venue that the Cuban government built for protests against the US. It's called the Anti-Imperialist Bandstand. Music lovers from all over Cuba headed to the capital for a truly once-in-a-lifetime event. Chris could not afford to disappoint this crowd that was hungry for entertainment. Cuban officials estimate that 70,000 people showed up for this concert. Audioslave performed an astounding 26 songs over 2.5 hours. Music lovers who never got the chance to see international stars jumped up and down, sang along, and even created a mosh pit. After the show, Chris had questions he wanted answers to. Because they were Americans, Audioslave had to jump through a lot of bureaucratic hoops to get to play in Cuba. But Chris wondered why bands from other countries didn't perform there. UK bands, for example, wouldn't face the same problems that American bands did. Years later, Chris was happy to hear that the Rolling Stones followed in his footsteps. Next, Chris would take on another UK institution. In 2006, the blockbuster series of films featuring James Bond was looking for a new theme song. They came to Chris with the title of the film, Casino Royale. While he was likely flattered by the offer, he had a problem. He couldn't imagine writing a song that included the words Casino Royale. The producers of Casino Royale made a concession and let him write a song that didn't mention the title of the film. The song he came up with was You Know My Name, and it reached the number 7 spot on the UK singles chart. The song had 2 first evers, one good and one not so good. Chris, who took inspiration for his Bond song from Paul McCartney's Live and Let Die, was the first male from the US to perform a 007 opening credit song. On the downside, his title song was the first to not make it on the soundtrack. Chris's next venture would put him face to face with a brand new sound. In 2009, Chris went in a completely different direction and teamed up with producer and rapper Timbaland. The result was Chris's third solo album, which he called Scream. This was a huge departure for Chris, as he mostly put aside his usual rock guitar sound and went with Timbaland's more electronic vibe. This was a huge risk. Would his fans like the new sound? While Chris described Scream as a highlight of his career, the critical response didn't quite match. Spin magazine said it had empty efficiency, and AllMusic called it one of those rare big-budget disasters. And then, Chris received a very personal response. It's one thing for a magazine to give you a bad review. It's quite another when a fellow musician does it. Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails gave Scream and Cornell one of the worst critiques. He said that Chris had embarrassed himself, Reznor was about to eat his words in a big way. Shortly after Reznor said such mean things about Chris on Twitter, Reznor had to take his words back. You see, he was about to embark on a tour with Soundgarden. Instead of facing what might have been an enraged Cornell, Reznor sent a cowardly apology via email. On April 2nd, 2009, a rock radio station in Atlanta got a brief name change. They called themselves Chris FM. What this meant was they devoted 24 hours of airtime to Chris Cornell. Besides playing back-to-back Cornell songs, it also included Chris working as a DJ and playing his favorite songs from his own songbook. Chris obviously had a lot of fans in Atlanta, but also in the White House. In 2013, Chris had a big night. It was on January 21st, and he played two very important events. He did an acoustic set for the Commander-in-Chief's ball, and then headed over to another ball. This was the inaugural ball for then-President Barack Obama. It doesn't get much better than playing for the president. Sadly, it was only downhill from there. On May 17, 2017, Chris performed with Soundgarden in Detroit, Michigan. After the concert, he retired to his room on the 11th floor of the MGM Grand Hotel. While in his room, he spoke on the phone with his wife Vicky Cornell. Vicky had some concerns that Chris didn't sound like himself. On the phone, he had repeatedly slurred his words. When Vicky questioned him about it, he told her he may have taken an extra anxiety pill or two. Pressed on what he meant, Chris told Vicky, "I'm just tired," repeating that same phrase several times over. The conversation was both confusing and out of character. She turned to Chris's bodyguard, Martin Kirsten, for help. She called Kirsten and asked him to check up on Cornell in his room. At 12:15 a.m., Kirsten headed to Cornell's room, only to find the door locked and no response from inside. He then went back to his own room and called the front desk. He talked to the security of the hotel, and they said they would not help him deal with Cornell. He once again contacted Vicky and asked her what she thought he could do. Her chilling response indicated just how worried she really was. Vicky's idea was to have Kirsten break down the hotel door. It took him 6 or 7 hits, but eventually the door went down. The first thing that Kirsten noticed was that the bathroom door was open, but most horrifyingly, he could also see Chris's feet. Kirsten, with Vicky on the phone, tried to deal with the unconscious Chris Cornell. Kirsten saw that there was some sort of band tightly wrapped around Chris's neck. He quickly removed it so he could breathe. Next, Kirsten compressed Chris's chest in hopes of resuscitating him. As he was doing this, EMTs arrived in an ambulance. It was now just before 1 a.m. Chris Cornell was officially pronounced dead at 1:30 a.m. Ultimately, the cause of his tragic demise was that he'd taken his own life. Of course, the first feeling was absolute devastation at the loss of such a prominent and talented musician. The next feeling was that of disbelief that this could happen. And then, people started to get suspicious. The first theory turned a suspicious eye at Kirsten and his timeline of that evening. The Detroit News wondered why it took 41 minutes for medical professionals to get on the scene. They were suggesting that this was too long, and maybe Kirsten wasn't telling the entire truth about what had happened. The public wanted answers. The authorities looked into the timeline that Kirsten had given about the events prior to Cornell's passing. Using phone call records and video footage, they decided that it all made sense. Kirsten was telling the truth about what happened that night. Next, the autopsy came under scrutiny. Vicky Cornell wasn't happy with the results of the autopsy. She thought they hadn't done a thorough job, and the result would be a host of conspiracy theories about the manner of Chris Cornell's death. One example she gave was that her husband had recently injured his head, something that hadn't been included in the autopsy. Chris's doctor was the next topic of complaint. Vicky and her children went after Cornell's doctor. They suggested that Dr. Robert Cobain offered Chris dangerous mind-altering substances and did this with negligence. They believed that the prescribed medicine Chris took clouded his judgment, ultimately leading him to making some very dangerous decisions that cost him his life. Vicky Cornell took complaints to the Los Angeles Superior Court. The evidence showed that Dr. Cobain had prescribed lorazepam to Chris without even seeing him. In his defense, Cobain said that Chris wanted the medication for his anxiety and that he was very aware of the risk of taking it. It was now left to the judge to decide if Cobain's actions had caused Cornell to lose his life. As it turned out, it wasn't up to the judge. Cobain and Cornell's family settled out of court, and this agreement remains confidential. With this behind them, Chris's family had him cremated. A funeral took place on May 26, 2017. It was a star-studded and emotional affair. Chris's funeral service began with the recording of Like a Stone by Audioslave. They followed this with Cornell's final song, The Promise. There was a live performance of Leonard Cohen's deeply moving Hallelujah, sung by Chester Bennington and Brad Delson of Linkin Park. At the end of the service, mourners could hear Temple of the Dog's All Night Thing. But the mourning didn't only occur at the funeral. On the day of Cornell's passing, Seattle's most iconic landmark, the Space Needle, turned the lights out for 1 hour to honor his passing. That same night, Ann Wilson of Heart was on Jimmy Kimmel Live, and she performed Soundgarden's Black Hole Sun. It was a tragic loss that some suggest we should have seen coming. Back in April 1994, Seattle rocker Kurt Cobain took his life in a very dark way. Cornell had to have taken the loss badly. In a Rolling Stones interview, Cornell said that it wasn't possible to see that a songwriter was going to take their life just by listening to the lyrics they wrote before the tragedy. Scientists didn't agree. They had something shocking to say about Chris's lyrics. Researchers analyzed Chris Cornell's lyrics and found that as his career progressed, he wrote more frequently about depression and failed relationships. They also noted that his songs contained more and more morbid thoughts. These scientists concluded that Cornell certainly could have benefited from clinical attention. Sadly, this information came too late. If you enjoyed this Factinate video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. Want to say in who we cover next? Join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.